begin with a bit of context to show you why it's so exciting. The name mainstream Nagra was coined by Professor Adam Hardy to describe what may be considered North India's most successful early lineage of temple architecture in terms of spread and productivity. It is mainstream in the sense that between the 7th to the 13th centuries, temples from this tradition were built across a broad swathe of North India, from Bihar, as we will see, through to Gujarat and down into the Deccan. The designs of the monuments evolved over time, and although temples were realized in different regional styles, they're underpinned by shared compositional features and organizational logic that mark them out as belonging to the same architectural family and distinguishing them. Because the maps disappeared. Was there a map there earlier? Was there a map there? No. In this image, there's meant to be a map so that the lines go to where the temples are from. Is there any way? Well, my maps have vanished, so I don't know what's happening there. It says that it can't be displayed on the computer. Okay, we'll keep going and I'll just pretend. Okay. Picture, if you will, that there's a map of India in the middle of this image, and it's got all the different temples, and it's pointing to all different locations across North India and down into the Deccan, thereby illustrating how widespread this mainstream temple architecture tradition was. And then I was going to point out that it's mainstream in the sense that these temples follow the same design logic, and it distinguishes them from more regional temples that, if you imagine there's a map in the middle of here, the Magadha school, which we know from sites like Nalanda and Temple 3 and Bodh Gaya, and then so the Arisen school, which is a regional type. This would be pointing to Chhattisgarh, etc. But they're built in more circumscribed areas. Between the 7th to the 10th century, Latina temples were the preeminent choice from the different modes of mainstream Nagra temple architecture. Imagine a map there as well. Latinas are named after the lata or creeper of proliferating gavaksha that climb down the central projection of their elegantly carved spires. You see here. That's the lata. As part of my PhD work some time ago, I analysed the way this temple type morphed over time across central India, and the main aim of the thesis was to reconstruct through drawings the ruined Latina temple spire of Temple 45 at Sanchi in Madhya Pradesh, based on a comprehensive analysis of the hundreds of fragments piled around the site. The reason I'm telling you this is because it pertains directly to the work I've been doing in Bihar, centered around my focus on architectural fragments and the stories that they have to tell. Because whilst there is little in the way of standing early temples from Bihar, if you pay attention to the wealth of fragmentary remains scattered across ancient East Madhya Desha and Magadha, many of which are unpublished and unstudied, and you extrapolate to identify and date the temples that they must have come from, you quickly build up a much richer picture of the early pre-Pala stone architecture from these areas and the key role that Bihar played, including Lakhisarai, in the genesis and early development of the mainstream Nagra tradition. The impact of the fragments around Bihar is significant not just for the history of Bihari temple architecture, but for the study of Nagra temple architecture in general. For despite the prevalence of Nagra temples in India, and over 2 centuries worth of scholarly analysis, there remain unresolved questions regarding how and where the mainstream Nagra tradition originated and developed. The earliest surviving mainstream Nagra monuments are the Navabrahma and Sangameshwara temples at Alampur, here. the Galganatha temple at Patadakal in Karnataka, and the Shiva temple at Mahwa in Madhya Pradesh, all from the mid to late century, 7th century. There'd be a map here, so imagine the map showing you where it all is. These, however, with their magnificent spires and sophisticated designs, are the mature latinas of a well-established tradition already working across a wide geographical spread. So the question is, how did we get there? How do these temples, with their towering spires, relate to India's earliest stone structural Gupta period temples from the 5th to the early 6th century, only a few of which remain standing? For example, Temple 17 at Sanchi in Madhya Pradesh, the Kankli Devi temple at Tigawa, etc. There would be a map here showing you where they were. And only one of them, the Vishnu temple at Deogarh, was found with vestiges of something resembling a proto-Nagra spire. So, how do we get from these flat-seeming temples to these towering Latina temples, which are in some ways the most easily recognizable of the North Indian temple? How do these temples relate to the Gupta temples? What did the early monuments from the formative period of the mainstream Nagra tradition during the second half of the 6th and the early 7th century, during this time period, what do they look like? And scholars are still debating this. The search for the origins of the Latina temple spire have been recurring themes from both Professor Michael Meister and Adam Hardy's substantial contributions to the study of Indian temple architecture. However, they've arrived at different conclusions. Whilst for both scholars, the Deogarh temple with its proto-Nagra spire was an important starting point, this would have been a map. Imagine a map. For Meister, temples from a broad range of localities and designs were also formative influences in creating these 7th century Latinas. For example, he points to the Rajavalachana temple at Rajim, for example, and other temples from Chhattisgarh, as playing a key formative role. He also talks about temples from the Salt Range in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan, for example, Temple D at Bilo, as also playing a key influence. His explanation is problematic from a chronological and practical point of view, but also because the Chhattisgarh spires are following a fundamentally different design logic to those of mainstream Latinas. For Adam Hardy, on the other hand, imagine a map. You do not need to look beyond the Gupta heartlands of eastern Madhya Pradesh, southern Uttar Pradesh, and West Bihar to find the sources. And in the absence of surviving temples, he draws on relief carvings of little temples from the Vishnu temple in Deogarh, which contain the seeds of mainstream Nagra in their designs, and uses pictures showing hypothetically how the one could have led to the other. So he looks at these little shrine images from different relief carvings, and then he imagines the steps that might lead to the precursors, which would inevitably end up, or maybe not inevitably, but which did end up with the Latina temple shape and construction. Oh, this is quite annoying. Imagine a map there, and all over Bihar there are lots of little gold stars showing how exciting it is, because I suggest that we turn our attention further east, because all the late and post-Gupta architectural fragments that I've been coming across on my field trips around Bihar pay testament to the fact that there was a great surge of architectural activity and creativity going on between the start of the 6th through to the beginning of the 8th century, which is just this period that we know so little about, supporting Adam's conjectures that mainstream Nagra began in the Gupta heartlands, and furthermore, as part of this, placing Bihar, i.e. East Madhya Desha and Magadha, front and center in the genesis and early development of the temple types, providing some of the missing links that connect late and post-Gupta architecture and then the mature mainstream Nagra tradition. In what follows, therefore, I'm going to very briefly talk through some of the 6th and early 7th century architectural remains that I've been coming across and their implications more broadly for our understanding of how early Nagra temple architecture began and developed in the opening centuries. So, sorry about the maps. I'm sure you can imagine what they would be showing. The reason I first became interested in Bihar was the Mundeshwari temple, a broad octagonal temple without a spire that I'm sure you are all familiar with, crowning one of the easternmost spurs of the Kaimur mountain range. Based on an inscription from a stele found on the side of the hill, typically dated to 635 CE, shown here, as well as the style of the mouldings and niches on the temple walls, the doorways, sweet doorways, and lots of early pilgrim inscriptions, the monument has been dated consistently to the second quarter of the 7th century, and it's celebrated by some as being India's oldest living temple. In 2020, I wrote a paper analysing the architecture, showing that the temple is anomalous with 7th century architectural design, early Nagra architectural design. Although it reuses door frames, mouldings, and even an inscription from early temples in its exterior design, the octagonal temple is a much later construction, coming from possibly the 16th or early 17th century, and perhaps even given a final facelift by the ASI during the restorations at the start of the 20th century. Now, this dramatic revision of the dating of the temple, that is such an important part of Bihari history, may be somewhat jarring, but I refer the interested or skeptical to my paper, which is, I think, fairly conclusive, and it may further reassure you, if my word isn't enough, that my dating has been accepted by scholars, including the late Rick Asher, George Michel, Jürgen Neuss, Hans Backer, etc., who'd all written about Mundeshwari previously. Now, this is not to denigrate the significance of Mundeshwari. Material, epigraphic, and textual evidence indicates, but Hans Backer has done work on the Skanda Purana, which he thinks refers to Mundeshwari as one of these key sites. All of these things show that it was clearly an important religious hub, producing cutting-edge architecture during the 7th century and earlier. It's just that the octagonal temple was not part of it. The partial remains of the actual temples from this early period lie dismantled and jumbled up in the drifts of architectural rubble that lie around the edges of the hill. As mentioned, I do love a pile of temple fragments, so I've been sifting through these for some years, and I hope sometime next year to undertake a comprehensive analysis of the fragments on the hill and find out exactly what the early temples from the site may have been like, and to try, where possible, whether there are enough fragments to illustrate what they would have looked like. These are just beginning ideas, but this is more a project for next year. In brief, though, and related to what we're talking about, and this enigmatic period that we don't really know, where we don't really understand the formative stages of of North India's most prolific temple building lineage, what we find on the hill are multiple phases of temple construction, from the start of the 6th century through to the end of the 7th, possibly early 8th century. I found fragments that seem to be coeval with and bear a strong similarity to those from the Shiva temple at Kumar. I haven't included on them because I'm quite excited and I'm still working on them, but I will very soon. So this would mean that there's a very early temple, late Gupta, from 500 to 525 CE. We have pieces from a small Latina temple from the second half of the 6th century. I can tell that they're that early because of the shape of the eaves. And there's also a little miniature temple, which is also from this early date. But this is it, thinking of the broader picture. Although it may not seem much if you're not a fragment fanatic, it's very exciting. These are little early Latina temples, the earliest we know of, or some of the earliest we know of. There's also fragments from a Latina from the mid-7th century, and then there are lots and lots of fragments from perhaps 2 larger Latina temples, likely from the late 7th century, broadly coeval with the aforementioned monuments at Alampur, Patadakal, and Mahua. So these are the monuments that form the early architectural history of Mandeshri. And what is exciting is they carry implications not just for the history of the locality or the history of Bihar, but for the history of Nagara temple architecture in general, providing critical further data to help flesh out our understanding of the origins and formative period of Nagara temple architecture, for which we have relatively little material evidence. And it seems to me that Mandeshri represents in many ways a sort of microcosm of the bursts of architectural activity that we find occurring across the rest of eastern Madhyadesha and further east into Magadha too in the pre-Pala period. Surges of temple building from the beginning of the 6th century, second half of the 6th, early to mid 7th century, late 7th to early 8th, and then we get later temples from the 15th century and onwards, stone temples. And in between, obviously, we have the Palas who built primarily in brick. To start with some of the new or lesser studied finds, we don't have to go far from Mandeshri, because less than a mile northeast of Mandeshri is a village called Mata, and it's home to its own collection of important and largely unstudied architectural remains. There are 84 of these, a mixed collection of artifacts, and of the 84, 17 are noted very briefly in Mira Sharma's catalogue of the sculptural remains at Mandeshri, although we disagree on questions of date and identification, and unlike Sharma, I don't think they necessarily migrated down the hill from Mandeshri, but instead may have originated from the village itself, which could have been, say, a subsidiary site to Mandeshri. Among the mixed sculptural and architectural remains, there are two collections that are of particular importance. First is a set of miniature Vallabhi temples. Vallabhi temples being temples with rectangular plans and barrel roofs with horseshoe-shaped gables at each end. These are carved from single blocks of stone, and when intact, they would have stood between 120 to 150 centimeters tall. I only include me to give you an idea of size, so they're There are about 15 sizable Vallabhi fragments and more smaller fragments, and because the superstructure of each has a different design, you can tell that they come from at least 7 individual shrines. 4 deities with attendants face out from each side at the base, combinations of Ithipalic Shiva, Vishnu, Surya, Ganesha, Tapasvini, Parvati, and in one instance, an Agni in one of the main ground shrines, niches. And they're linked closely in terms of iconography and style with the so-called Vajrastamba from Mandeshri as described in Asher's article on Panchayatana Lingas. But these are most definitely not pillars, for towering above the ground floor deities are sophisticated and elaborate multi-storied superstructures, each a different multi-adicular composition, meaning they're made up of combinations of multiple miniature shrine images, or edicules, capped by tunnel roofs with arched gables. And a busy and varied entourage of gods and Dikpala look out from the superstructures, residing in the central Vallabhi edicules and in the gables themselves. Lakulisha appears multiple times, which, along with the linga-shaped gavakshas and the Ithipalic Shivas, suggests that the shrine models were Pashupata Shaivite in affiliation. I'm including in the set a Vallabhi fragment that's currently in the Bihar Museum Reserve Collections that in the literature has been misidentified as a lintel. It's attributed to Mandeshri, but I wonder if it's from Mata for various reasons, but it comes from the same set. From my analysis, presented in this paper, I think that the shrine models were carved at different points over the last quarter of the 6th century through to the beginning of the 7th century. And I point to the shape of the eaves, to the fact that the hands of these gavaksha, whose shape don't reach up to the top, and lots of little details which, if you're aware of them, give you quite a clear reading on the date of architectural fragments, if you're lucky. This makes them a very exciting find, because albeit in miniature, what they represent are our first surviving examples of mainstream Nagra shrines from the formative period of the tradition, our very first. They're the only ones with their upper stories intact, and in this sense, the fact that they're small helped them, because the actual structural temples have all been damaged and it's all fallen apart, but because they're so solid, small and sturdy, they've survived. And what we see in their superstructures are multi-adicular arrangements based on mainstream Nagra compositional principles, with miniature Vamsana shrines at the corners of each bhumi and Vallabhi edicules at the centre. Miniature Vamsanas, and then these are Vallabhis. And if you include an even earlier miniature Vallabhi from Mundeshri, currently in Mundeshri storehouse, this one perhaps from the mid-6th century, as a collection, each with their individual designs, they're like little templates from the formative years of the architectural tradition, and they show the initial manoeuvres, compositional possibilities and dynamics for formal growth that led to the creation of the mainstream Nagra, and will underpin mainstream Latina and Vallabhi temple architecture for centuries to come, validating some of the steps in Hardy's then hypothetical pictures of how the Latina may have come about. So that's Adam's, those are mine. There's a second significant collection of fragments of at Mata, and these are a group of friezes with recessed niches set between pilasters with sensitively realized lotus medallions. Each of the niches is like a miniature heavenly stage featuring a varied cast of performers, including cavorting and performing Ghana musicians and dancers, some wrestlers, a very beautiful piece, I think, as well as theatrical scenes. Oh, sorry about this, it seems to get a bit jumbled, including scenes from Ramayana, and I suggest scenes from the little clay card. I'm finishing up a paper about this now, but to speed things along, I think at least some of these, maybe all of them, come from an earlier period than the Vallabhis. The Vallabhis, I think, come from the final quarter of the 6th, early 7th. I think these might come from the late Gupta period, from maybe the 2nd quarter of the 6th century. And there's a little fragment of pillar from Mata, which I think is from the same time period. And I mention this, one of the reasons I'm dating this to the first half of the 6th century is this beading with the cylindrical bead in the centre. And I say this because it will be relevant when we get to talk about the remains that are shot down. I'm not dwelling on this, but my point is, as a sort of broad overview, within this East Majidesha locality, we are seeing temples being built from the first half of the 6th century, some fragments even possibly from the end of the 5th century, and then we're seeing temples from the mid-7th century onwards through to the early 8th. And what we're going to do is see these time periods continuing, these periods of architectural activity continuing further south and east. Remains of monuments from the same time periods, of types that are often associated more with sites further west in Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. Some of the Bihari remains come from very early Latinas, some of which predate and foreshadow those from Mahwa, Alampur, Patadakal. Some coeval, driving home the formative role that the region, i.e. Bihar, played in establishing the architectural lineage. Because of time, I'm just going to leapfrog across a few sites across Bihar on my way to Krimila to give you a taste of what I mean. Studies of the history of Rohtas Hill and looking at the artifacts and material remains often begin with a 13th century inscription and then move on to the 16th century fort and later temples. But there are also the remains of a Latina temple here from perhaps the mid to the second half of the 7th century. There's also an early, possibly 6th century part of a pillar in the tomb of Hassan Khan in Sasaram. And these there are obviously these beautiful, right on top of Rotas Hill, there's obviously these beautiful early latinas built in a purest mainstream Nagra tradition, filling in this gap in our knowledge and showing that this is a kind of fountainhead, that Bihar is a sort of fountainhead for this Nagra tradition which went on to, in many ways, define North Indian temple architecture. At both Nalanda and Bodh Gaya, we see mainstream Nagra architects, quite interestingly, working in stone alongside a different guild of architects from the Magadha school. So the exquisite base of mouldings from Temple 2 at Nalanda show that there was once an early 7th century mainstream Nagra monument here. It's gorgeous. And the wealth of fragments at Nalanda from a sizable mainstream Nagra Latina spire come from the mid to the second half. No, I would say come from the end of the 7th century, perhaps the beginning of the 8th century. So we have this tradition, this mainstream Nagra tradition, going further east into Magadha, and what's more, we have two architectural traditions working alongside each other. We see the same thing at Bodh Gaya, where there are multiple 7th century mainstream Nagra door frames. There's this little part of a Latina spire showing that there are Latina temples being there. Completely different architectural lineage to the Bodhi temple. And I'd like to point to how this doorway at Bodh Gaya closely resembles an early 7th century door lintel from Chapra in Madhya Pradesh, to show how consistent the designs are across such a broad area at this early point. This was a surprise. I was at Kovidal at the beginning of the year, it was near the Barabar Hills, and they're best known for the deities that are cut into the stone outcrops. But what did I find? But a lone Latina spire fragment from the mainstream Nagra tradition from perhaps the late 7th, early 8th century. Just all on its own. I mean, it has stories to tell. And then en route to Lakhisarai, was it yesterday even?
Yeah.
It was yesterday. Yesterday on the way to Lakhisarai, we stopped at Daptu village and we saw mainstream Nagra doorways from, I would suggest, late 7th, possibly early 8th. But 7th, I'd say 7th century doorway. In fact, no, I'm going to stick to 7th. The reason I think it's definitely 7th, the problem is I can only see short there and long there. It's because it has this T-shaped door frame, like a capital T, and that's a door frame shape that you see in the Gupta period, you see in the 7th century, but you don't see it anymore after that. The reason I know it's not Gupta period is because if you see the shape of the eaves here, that the Gavaksha pediments are pressing from, they have thick lips, and you don't get, in the 6th century, you don't get those thick lips. It's one of these key datas. So I already know it's earliest 7th century, and then I see the T-shaped doorway, and I think, well, it can't be later than the 7th century, therefore we're safely in the 7th century, and from there on we can do more detailed analysis. So I would say late 7th century, that is my guess. And it's an interesting site because in terms of the way Bihari temple sites develop, and this is relevant for Lakhisarai, the way they have a long life, and so you get these early temple remains, and then they're added to these pillars we've been discussing, and I've been discussing with Shashi, and maybe 15th century. So added to by more temple remains. There are brick temple remains there. There are parlor sculptures, quite famous, so clearly there's activity in the 11th century. So these temple sites have these lives where the architecture evolves. Finally, we come to Lakhisarai. And here, from this overview of what's happening, across with mainstream Nagra architecture, we see something fascinating. And that is, we're seeing architecture from the same time periods that I was talking about, as early 6th through up to the 7th, early 8th, the 8th century, displaying some of the key stylistic and compositional traits that identified the earlier pieces as belonging to these time periods, i.e. late Gupta and post-Gupta. But unlike the sandstone pieces and some granite from further west, i.e. in Nalanda and in East Madhya Desha, The pieces here are being crafted from the local dark stone that's so well known from the Pala period sculpture, and according to Asher is chloritoid phyllite. And because of the qualities of the stone and how it is to work with, and possibly because they're using local sculptors rather than shipping in sculptors from further west, or from Sarnath, say, they display quirks and flavours that the sandstone fragments don't have. And as time continues, they go a bit wonky if you're talking about purest Nagra or the late Gupta ideal, which I'm going to quickly look at. I don't know if I've run mad. Have I gone over time? Can I keep going? Sorry. I'll be quick. The sculptures and architectural remains from and at Ashokdam have been studied and discussed by many eminent scholars, some of whom are here today. R.D. Banerjee, not here. Cunningham, not here. Rikasha, Claudine, here. Anil Kumar, Lakshmi Greaves, Rajat Samyal, etc. There are a few things that distinguish my assessment of the fragments from others. From the fragments from Rajwana and the environs that are collected at Ashokdam and other places today. Firstly, I don't think that they come from the same time period. And I think they echo the same phases of construction that we see further west, perhaps continuing along for a bit longer. So that, in some ways, that makes it easier because you're not trying to tie together what the pillars look like with what the architectural remains look like. Firstly, the beautiful pillars, with the kinaras and the half medallions, and the scenes that Lakshmi Greaves has identified as coming from the Mahabharata. They've received significant attention, with some scholars dating them from the late 5th to early 6th century and some putting them slightly later in the 7th. I agree with Asher and Williams and date them to the first quarter of the 6th century, because along with the vegetal swirls and the elegant, graceful figures, which they've noted, I'd like to draw attention to the correlation between them and an equivalent 6th century pillar from Bitari, which Lakshmi was talking about, the location. See, for example, this is from Rajorana, and this one is from Bitari. And actually, as again Lakshmi has noted in her paper, these would have been part of these taller pillars with different sections rising up. So it would have been not dissimilar to this in shape entirely. This is from Bhumara, Shiva Temple at Bhumara, and I just wanted to bring your attention to the similarities in the way, the fondness for these Kinara. So that's one reason why I agree with Asher. Another reason is this little noted fact here, and that's the hairstyle of this guy from one of the pillars. From what I can tell, and I must admit I haven't seen it in person, but from photos, he seems to have this hairstyle with a crescent of hair that's like circles a flattened circular portion in the front. This is very Gupta period, and it'd be interesting to talk to Lakshmi about it. But it's a hairstyle that you only tend to see in the Gupta period and the late Gupta period. So we see it here at Bhumara. This is from Mandasore from the 6th century. This is from Mathura with that circular thing. And so the fact that he has that hairstyle says to me that it's early. Also the shape of the eaves says to me that it's 6th century, and so on and so forth. The beading, if you remember, I mentioned this beading and then a cylindrical one. Beading and then a cylindrical one. I mentioned this last year, but it's a type of beading that you only tend to get early. This is from Bhumara, this is a 5th century Buddha image from Sarnath that again has the beading, cylindrical. So the very fact that it has these cylindrical beads, to me, also suggests that it's Gupta. The wonderful Ramayana panel at Ashokdam has been discussed in detail by Lakshmi Greaves, and they've been dated variously. For my part, all I would say is that it's tricky, because there aren't any of the key things that I usually look at that point one way or the other. I was drawn to the attention of this type of stool with the legs that have the lathe-turned legs, as it were. And you get these in early 6th century images, like this type of stool. Also, this one is from Mata, which I put to the second half of the 6th century. But you also get them later in Nalanda. So I will go with what Lakshmi thinks, but I wouldn't, since that you say that there's Ramayana and Mahabharata often together, perhaps they could be Gupta, but it would be interesting to discuss further. And very, very quickly, as for the architectural remains, jumbled together at Ashokdam, these do not come from one big temple, as has been stated in earlier studies, but instead they come from a cluster of small latinas, a group that may have been added to over time, straddling, I suggest, the early 7th through to the 8th century, and continuing to have been visited and patronised even after that, as attested to by the 10th century inscription that Dr. Rajat Sanyal has worked on. These are miniature Mandapika temples, that is simple and of a smaller temple type than larger latinas. So the Mandapika temples are constructed of pillars with slabs of stone in between. For example, here, one's here, so pillars and then slabs of stone. This is one here. And sometimes, if they're smaller, the walls may be carved out of one slab of stone. Rather than having a more complicated arrangement of door guardians and attendants on either side of the entrance, they tend to have figures in niches, as seen here at Ashokdam, and also seen here at Batesra, and here at Narestra, which is close to Gwalior from a bit later on. The Mandapikas would have been crowned with small Latina spires, collections of which have been stuck together here. I presume that some of the niches seen in the Lakhisarai Museum and in the Ashokdam Museum would have been on the walls. Someone needs to measure them and work out the logistics of what could go with what and where, which belongs with which. In terms of dating them, you see features that, if you were talking about further west, would make them 6th century. In particular, there's this geometric pattern around the door, which you get on some 6th century temples. For example, the Shiva temple at Bumara. I noticed one in your talk, Lakshmi, as well. And then there's one in the 6th century temple at Shakor in Damoh. However, we shouldn't be too hasty in thinking, therefore, that the earliest Mandapika temples at Ashokdam are 6th century, because A, you also get them, although in a sort of simplified form, at, for example, the 7th century doorframe in Daptu village. Also there's one from Bodh Gaya, although it's less ornate. But one of the main reasons why I don't think that they're 6th century, why I think they're 7th century, the early ones, is because of the pillars. These are the pillars from Ashokdam, in which you see the Gata Palava, the vase of plenty at the base, and there'd be another one at the top, and then you have the medallions with the Kirti Mukha face. In the earlier period, with these different parts, the loops here don't hang down very far. There's a plain section between, and then you get the Gata Palava. So here is one from the early 6th century, Kirti Mukha face. The loop from his mouth doesn't hang down very far, and then you get the panel. Again, this is one from Mata. And as time goes on in the 7th century, the chain, the sort of tongue chain, flower chain starts to hang down further, and flowers start to sprout out of the vases. By the time we get to Ashokdam, it's come down really far, the flower has come up higher still, and they've touched each other, which is why I wouldn't put them in the 6th century. You can see all these little pillars. I would say there's something quite strange about them, because you have some which clearly seem early and they follow the mainstream Nagra patterns and proportions very carefully, like this little image of Durga with these smooth gavakshas, these detailed early looking pilasters. But then you get images where everything has gone a bit, the proportions are a bit wonky, the lines are a bit wobbly, the pillars are a bit clumsy. Similarly, with the pilasters, you get legitimately early seeming ones, and then you get copies, what seem like copies of the earlier ones, but done in a more haphazard, less ordered, less delicate way. In summary, I wonder if there were early mandapikas there, copying this purest early mainstream Nagra temple designs, possibly from the late 6th century onwards, and then over time, the inspiration for these early mainstream had died out, but they keep copying their own temples. It's almost a bit like inbreeding. You know, they keep copying the own temple style to try and recreate these Gupta-seeming temples in the 8th century, maybe on into the Pala century, because although they build big brick temples, they might still work on smaller stone temples. And therefore we just have this great range of little temples clustered around. For example, this to me seems like it's going towards a Pala period Gabaksha style. And just to reiterate, it's really exciting. There is nowhere else is there this collection of dark stone temples from over several centuries that it's a brand new school of temple architecture. It's the mainstream Nagara, but done in a totally different style, using local craftsmen, local guilds. It continues for years, and it does it differently, and yet it's so connected to the mainstream Nagara and the post-Gupta, rather than what happens in the Pala dynasty. So it's an exciting thing for architecture. In conclusion, and I apologise for going over time, although there are no early stone temples left standing in Bihar, if we take into consideration the wealth of fragmentary remains from the region that we see during the 6th to 8th century, there's this great fluorescence of stone Nagara temple architecture being built. So alongside parts of UP and MP, which we know all about from a North Indian temple architecture perspective, Bihar was one of the crucibles of Nagara temple architecture, with thriving architectural centres showcasing the latest developments in temple design. And if this swelling tide of stone architectural production and innovation subsided during the 8th century, rather than gaining in momentum and sweeping across as it did further west, this is partly to do with the Pala dynasty, and in architectural terms, due to the fact that the brick and stucco tradition of temple architecture were clearly working alongside them, and therefore sort of competing with them, if you will. So they were drawing from and transforming the brick tradition of the Gupta temple architecture, and then they carried on, possibly linked to the fact that Buddhism continued and flourished here as it didn't further west, where the surge of mainstream Nagara temple buildings spread unimpeded, championed during the Pratihara period and beyond. And within that, Krimila is extremely exciting for its very own school, which fits with Professor Kumar's work about how it's this urban centre, thriving cultural centre, fits with Claudine Bautz-Picon's work about how where sort of individual schools of sculpture were developing. Very quickly, I'd like to thank Lakshmi Greaves and Adam Hardy for interesting conversations, Anil Kumar and Mr. Manoranjan for introducing me to the artifacts at Ashokdam and Lalpahari, Shashi Alhawat and Abhishek Kumar for helping enable these field trips, and Prince Kumar and Will Kwiatkowski for being the best field trip companions. Thank you. Sorry, a bit long.
We have so many questions.
Oh, do you? How long was it?